Spunky by Dori Brink. If you missed the first 3 chapters, go back and find them because we're on chapter 4. A few days later, trusting only my instincts, I chose Peter. I found him unexpectedly. Very early in the morning, the sound of hammering awakened me. I shook myself and went outside the garage. The rain had stopped, although a chilly wetness clung to everything. The hammering was coming from the fields where the land had been cleared. Drifting through the air from the direction of the hammering came the pungent smell of coffee. My hunger was an ache inside me, and the chance of finding food made me wild with hope. I ran as fast as I could. Parked on the road near the cleared field was a food wagon. Workmen were gathered around it, eating and drinking. On the open side of the wagon, piled high on a counter, were layers of sandwiches, rolls, and cakes. Steaming coffee was being poured into cups and handed to the men. I almost choked at the sight of it. How could I get some? I edged in between their feet, trying not to be stepped on. They were talking and laughing. No one noticed me. I barked up at one of the men, shifting my paws and tossing my head for emphasis. He looked down at me and smiled, then tore off a piece of bread from his sandwich and threw it to me. I caught it midair and gobbled it down. "Hey, that's cute," he said. Another man looked down. He threw me a piece of cake. Then another man and another. Soon they were all tossing pieces of bread and cake into the air. I chased after each piece, gulping it down while frantically going after the next piece. They were all laughing now. One of the men dangled a whole donut high above my head. "Jump! Jump!" he shouted. I leaped up and tried to grab it, but the man pulled his hand away just as I snapped my jaws together. My teeth sank into his fleshy thumb. "Ouch!" he cried. His face was twisted with pain and anger. With a fierce motion, he kicked me in the ribs. I yelped at the pain, then snapped at his leg. He yelled and came after me, but I swirled around in back of him and caught his trousers between my teeth. I pulled and pulled, trying to tear them apart. The man floundered off balance, dancing on one foot. The other men gathered around us, laughing and shouting. I didn't lose my grip, even when the man struck my nose. "What's this, a karate match?" A forceful voice penetrated the commotion, and suddenly all the laughing and shouting stopped. The man I had been struggling with slackened his dance, and I dropped my jaws. He stepped back. Just having a little fun with this mutt," he said, shuffling his feet. I looked up at the man who had made everything stop. It was the first time I saw Peter. His face was set into firm lines, but the eyes looking down at me had a kind, soft light in them. A wave of tenderness came over me, and I felt I was breathing in his kindness. He knelt down and stroked my ear. His touch was gentle. All at once, I knew that he was someone I could live with. How could I tell him? Peter straightened up and said to the others, "Okay, fun's over. So's the coffee break." The men broke into loud talk and laughter again as they moved toward a row of skeleton houses going up alongside the road. I followed behind Peter. Now and then, he stopped to examine the wooden frames being nailed together. Then he walked down the road to his trailer. I was right behind him. He opened the door and quickly went inside, shutting me out. Why was he trying to get away from me? I sprawled down on the step in front of the door, listening to the sound of his movements inside. A phone rang, and I heard the faint murmur of his soothing voice. It lulled me into a peaceful sleep. Chapter 5. Footsteps awakened me. Peter was coming outside again. I scrambled to my feet and quickly followed him. He got into his car and drove back to the work site. I chased after him. When he got out to talk with his workmen, I sprawled on my belly, resting my chin on my front paws. I waited until he walked on. Sometimes he inspected the work closely. Other times he stopped only long enough to make a man laugh with a few words or clap someone on the back without losing stride. Whatever his pace, I kept up with him. One time, he stopped near a group of men putting up long planks of wood lying on the ground. He took a pencil out of his pocket and huddled over a huge piece of paper with one of the workmen. I knew it would be a long wait. I sat down in the middle of the plank 2 workmen were about to lift up. They tried to get me off, but I ran back and forth out of their reach. It was fun. "Hey, Peter, you better take your dog away," one of the workmen called, trying to grab me. "That's not my dog," Peter said, walking toward me. I jumped off the plank and ran to meet Peter, smiling up at him. He turned away. He moved on to another group of men, pouring soft cement into a hole in the ground. They smoothed it very carefully, and it looked shiny and inviting. I padded across it. Peter scooped me up into his arms and carried me back to his car. "Stay here," he commanded, and shut the door. I liked being in Peter's car and settled down to sleep. When Peter let me out, it was growing dark. I was ready to walk along with him, but he quickly went to the other side of the car and got in, closing the door before I reached it. Then he roared away from me. I ran with all my might. At the trailer, he stopped the car and got out. Panting and breathless, I managed to slip by the door just as he opened it. Peter shook his head and looked down at me, then went to the water cooler and filled a cup. He put it on the floor. "That's for you," he said. I drank greedily. Peter packed some papers into a case and snapped it shut, put on his jacket, and slipped his cigarettes into a pocket. Standing beside the desk, he picked up the phone and made it buzz. "Hi, Daphne. What's good?" His voice was especially soft and friendly, different from the way it sounded when he talked to anyone else during the day. "Yeah? Okay. I'll be home in a little while. I'm leaving now. Okay, Daphne. Bye." Peter strode to the door, and I kept close to his heels, ready to leave with him. With one hand on the doorknob, he looked down at me. "You stay here tonight," he said firmly, then knelt down and gently pushed me back. He went outside, closing the door behind him. It soon grew dark inside the trailer, but his chair and desk were there, and I could sniff traces of his footsteps on the floor, and beside the wastebasket, a paper towel he had used to dry his hands. These things comforted me. The cup of water gleamed at me from the floor. I settled down under Peter's desk to sleep. Early the next morning, I heard his car door slam. With a burst of sunlight, the trailer door opened. I jumped up at Peter's legs, then ran in wild circles around him. I did a somersault, then rolled on my back, pawing the air in ecstasy. Peter knelt down and smiled. Deep crinkles appeared around his eyes. His gentle touch played with my ears. I stared into his face intently. How could I tell him what I wanted? Soon, men came into the trailer, asking questions and rattling papers. The phone rang. More men came in. Through the open door came a whiff of the food wagon. I went outside. I was very hungry. Workmen were already gathering around the wagon, eating and drinking. I sat down on the foot of one of the men. He looked down and chuckled, then tossed me a piece of roll. Soon, the other men were tossing pieces of cake and bread into the air for me to catch. I scrambled after every piece. Then, the man who had kicked me the day before stood in front of me. He dangled a fat piece of donut over my head. "Jump," he said harshly. I steadied my legs and growled up at him. "Come on, jump," he repeated. A snarl rose deep within my throat, and I bared my teeth. "Ain't that something?" someone said. "Gutsy little pup," said another. I held my ground until the man lowered his hand and shuffled away from the crowd of men around the wagon. Through all the commotion, I heard Peter's voice. He was drinking coffee and talking quietly with one of the men. I went over to him and he looked down at me. A smile played around his lips. Then, Suddenly, his eyebrows drew together and his face settled into a frown. He turned his head away. The other men were all around me now, watching curiously. "Where do you suppose he came from?" one of them asked. "Beats me. There are more stray dogs in these parts than you can shake a stick at." "Looks to me like he's half sheepdog and half terrier." "He's a terror, all right." Laughter. "Cute, though. Too bad he's got no one to take care of him." "Looks to me like he can take care of himself." More laughter. Not from Peter. He wasn't smiling, and his eyebrows seemed to be even more closely drawn together. But at least he was looking at me again. He put his cup down, shrugged his shoulders back as if he were trying to shake something loose, and walked briskly away. I followed him. He glanced back at me and walked faster. When he reached his car, he jumped into it and roared down the road. I chased after the wheels, running with all my might through the dust and fumes. A short distance away, he stopped and got out. I was right there to greet him, wagging my tail triumphantly. He just stood there frowning and scratching his head. "What in the world am I going to do with you?" he muttered. I smiled up at him, but he turned away. For several days it was the same. At night, Peter let me sleep in his trailer, but during the day, more and more often, he jumped into his car and roared away from me. So one afternoon, when he did this, instead of chasing after him, I went to his trailer. Sooner or later, I knew he would return. I sprawled down on the step in front of the door and rested my paws on my chin. It was a long wait. When he finally drove up and got out of his car, he just walked over to where I was lying and glared down at me with his hands on his hips. I sat up and scratched my ear, pretending not to notice he was there. Suddenly he laughed, and I looked up at him. All the deep crinkles in his face were showing. "You're just about as smart as they come, aren't you?" he said. He held the door of his trailer wide open for me, then went straight to the phone. He spoke in that special, friendly voice. "Hi, Daphne. How would you like a dog?" "A dog. Yeah, I know we're not allowed to have dogs in the apartment, but we'll be out of there in a couple of weeks." "What?" "He's black and white. Shaggy. Long curly hair. Big brown eyes. Okay, I'll bring him home tonight. Bye. Hey, his name's Spunky." "Yeah, Spunky. Bye." Chapter 6. When Peter shut the door of his trailer that evening, I was outside with him. "We're going home," he said. I looked up at him carefully. There was no frown on his face. I jumped at his legs and wagged my tail joyfully. Peter was taking me home. I sat close beside him in the car, and from time to time I turned to meet a smile with my own. At last we stopped in front of a building with rows of windows in it. I followed Peter up a flight of stairs, and he opened a door with his key. As soon as we entered, a woman came toward us. She stopped in front of me, her legs planted wide apart. She was tall and slim. Long, dark hair curved around one side of her neck and fell down in sparkling waves as she leaned forward. Her dancing eyes seemed to catch the light of a nearby lamp. I wagged my tail nervously. "Say hello to Daphne, Spunk," Peter said. "Black and white!" she exclaimed. "I can hardly see the white." "Well," said Peter, "he needs a little cleaning up." She laughed and scooped me off the floor. "Into the tub you go." She carried me into a small room and promptly turned on a steaming thunder of water that made vicious whirlpools inside the tub. I tried desperately not to let her put me into this horror. I wriggled and yelped, but her hands held me firmly. Water and sweet-smelling soap were poured over me, and I was scrubbed from head to foot with foaming bubbles. I nipped her hand. "Ouch!" she cried. "You stop that!" Her hands moved swiftly, and I did my best to nip her again. I succeeded once or twice, but she didn't stop. At last, I was lifted out and smothered in a huge towel. She rubbed me briskly. Then I was released. I shook the water out of my ears and heard her cry out. I ran through the apartment, rubbing myself into anything I could find. The air was chilly. In one room, there was a bed with frilly material covering its sides. I rubbed myself against it gratefully. Then I heard her footsteps coming after me. Quickly, I crawled underneath the bed. Part of the frilly material was lifted up, and I saw her face peering at me sideways. I backed into the farthest corner. "Come on out, Spunky. The bath's over." I didn't move. "Don't you want some dinner?" Her voice was lilting, but when I wouldn't come out, she sighed impatiently, and the frill dropped back into place. I heard her leave the room. In the dim light under the bed, I could make out a familiar object. Peter's shoes. I curled myself on top of them and sulked. All I had wanted was to be with Peter in a cozy home where he would toss me wonderful things to eat, where he would stroke me and make me feel warm inside. Instead, I was trapped in a place where a strange woman could scoop me up and shock me with chilling wetness. The bitter taste of disappointment settled on my tongue. Soon, the smell of food drifted into the room. I heard the sound of plates rattling, and I knew they were eating. I crept out from under the bed and cautiously followed the mouth-watering aroma into the kitchen. They were seated at a table. Peter was putting a forkful of meat into his mouth. "Oh, there you are, Spunk," he said. Daphne turned her head, and a look of wonder came into her eyes. "He really is black and white." She got up quickly and took a bowl out of the cupboard. I watched intently as she poured milk into it, then cracked open an egg and plopped it into the milk. She stirred the mixture together and placed the bowl on the floor. I lapped it up greedily. Delicious. Still licking my whiskers, I sat down next to Peter's feet and watched him eat. I stared hard at every mouthful of food he chewed until he shifted in his chair and threw me a sliver of meat. Incredibly delicious. "Don't give him anything, Peter. He has to learn good manners," Daphne said. "A little piece of meat won't hurt him." Peter let me eat another piece right out of his hand. This was more like it. Early the next morning, I awoke with a start and jumped off the soft armchair I had cuddled into during the night. Peter was at the door saying goodbye to Daphne. I ran to him, anxious to leave the house. I wagged my tail happily, waiting for the door to open so I could run down the stairs with Peter. But he gently pushed me away from the opening. "You stay here with Daphne," he said. A feeling of dread came over me. He smiled at Daphne. "Make sure Mrs. Baxter doesn't see him." "Don't worry," she replied. "I won't take him out during the day. I'll do my shopping tonight. She's not likely to see us after dark." "Good," Peter said, and patted me on the head. He closed the door behind him, and I listened to his footsteps fade away. I was alone with Daphne, trapped. Sure enough, she scooped me up and carried me into the kitchen. She spread a pile of newspapers around one corner of the room and set me down on top of them. "Stay," she commanded, pointing her finger at me, her legs wide apart. I darted between her legs and ran into the living room. I squatted down and wet the rug. Screams, "No, no!" She grabbed me and carried me back to the pile of newspapers. "Do it there," she commanded, towering over me, one hand on her hip, the other pointing to the newspaper. I waited. Hunger was rippling inside me. I wanted to eat, to chew something. She mixed egg and milk into a bowl, and for a few moments I tasted delight. Later that afternoon, I sulked on my pile of newspapers, listening to the sounds Daphne was making at the sink. The feeling of being trapped churned inside me. I longed to run the fields and roam the streets, to be free to do whatever I pleased, no one to scream at me and hold me back. As soon as she left the room, I darted out again. I crawled underneath a table and began to sharpen my teeth against the wood. "Come out of there," she cried. She had to crawl down on her hands and knees to reach me. back we went to the newspaper. This time, when her back was turned, I ran to the bedroom and tested my teeth on some low-hanging curtains. They began to shred easily. More screams. When she brought me back, I stood rigidly on top of the paper. She pressed my back down with her hand until my hind legs bent underneath me. "Sit," she said. I knew how to sit. What did she want from me? Daphne began to rub spicy scents into meat and cut up vegetables. My mouth watered. Soon, the smells of roast pork filled the room. I sighed and sprawled flat on my belly, breathing in the aroma of the sizzling meat. I closed my eyes and thought of the slivers Peter would give me at dinner time. Would it taste as good as the scraps I'd found when I was free? No, it would be much, much better than anything I'd ever tasted before. Still, I longed to be running about, and resentment soured my mouth. One of these days, I promised myself, I would find a way to escape from Daphne. I would run as far away as I could go. With visions of myself galloping through fields, I dozed until Peter came home. After dinner that night, Daphne put the collar around my neck and clipped the leash onto it. Peter had proudly brought these home with him, so I didn't struggle when she put them on. But a sinking feeling found its way to the pit of my stomach. Now she would lead me around wherever she pleased. "Be back in a little while," she called out. Peter was in another room, busily working on some papers. "Don't let Mrs. Baxter catch you," he called back cheerfully. "Oh, she's probably in bed by now. Besides, Spunky needs the exercise." Daphne opened the door and hurried down the stairs. There was a blob of chewing gum, a candy wrapper, and other interesting tidbits in the nooks and corners of the stairs. Each time I strained to get at them, she yanked me back. The collar tore into my neck. "Walk nicely," she commanded. I tugged and tugged. She pulled harder. Outside on the street, I wanted to stop and examine everything we passed. She wouldn't let me. How could I ever get free? Now I was something I had once pitied. A dog tied to a leash. People passing by smiled at us. "That's a little bit of heaven," one woman said, stopping to pat my head. Daphne smiled down at me, but her hold on my collar never eased. I couldn't follow the curious woman. We approached a huge building with doors that swung open for us all by themselves. As soon as we were inside, so many food smells hit my nostrils at once that I tugged at the leash frantically. I wanted to taste every single one of them. A man walked up to us. "Sorry, miss, no dogs allowed in the store." Daphne led me outside again. Near the swinging doors, she found a pole and tied the leash around it. After she made sure it was secure, she stood over me and pointed her finger at my nose. "Stay," she commanded. I rose up on my hind legs and pawed the air. I could not pull loose. She walked away into the store. I was alone in front of a bewildering place where people walked in and out, passing me by. Some stopped to smile at me or pat my head, but no one released me, no matter how loud I barked. Daphne came out of the store carrying a large grocery bag. It was a relief to be freed from the pole at last. We started back along the same streets we had taken before. When we came to the door leading upstairs to the apartment, Daphne gasped. A heavy-set woman with her hands on her hips stood in front of us, blocking the way. "Is that your dog?" The woman's voice was shrill and accusing. "Yes, Mrs. Baxter." Daphne was fidgeting with the leash. She added quickly, "It's only for a couple of weeks until we move. He won't be any trouble." "There are no dogs allowed in this building." "Yes, but—" The leash slipped out of Daphne's hands, and I wriggled over to the woman and sniffed the hem of her skirt. Then I raised my head and looked straight into her eyes. The stiffness in her body melted. She bent down and patted my head. I smiled. "He's a cutie," she muttered under her breath. Daphne quickly nodded her head. "He's very good. He's housebroken already." That was a lie. I could still hear her screams of "No, no!" echoing in my head each time I had gone near the rug that day. "Well, make sure he doesn't dirty up the place." "Oh, he won't," said Daphne happily. We ran up the steps and into the apartment. Whew! Daphne said, and plumped into a low chair. She reached out and grabbed me onto her lap. "Give me a kiss," she demanded. She took hold of the tufts of hair under my chin and brought my face close to hers. Then she kissed me on the nose. "Kiss," she said. Dim memories came back to me on my mother's tender lapping. The snug warmth I felt when I cuddled under her neck. The way I had returned her kisses with my own. Now I had no desire to kiss anyone. I jumped off Daphne's lap and made her angry. She crouched down on the floor and screwed her face up. I growled at her. She growled back and jabbed at me with one hand. It was all I needed. I lunged at her, biting her wherever my teeth could land. "Ouch!" she cried, covering her head with both arms and rolling over on the floor. I came at her again with all my force. She cuffed me on the side of the mouth and sat up. "No biting," she said sternly, "and no more wetting the rug." I glared up at her, snarling. Her face softened. "Boy, Spunk, you're mean." She said this with unexpected tenderness and stroked my ears. I stopped snarling. Tune in next time for Chapter 7.